Hello, everyone, and welcome to Opportunity China's third pre-departure webinar. Thank you very much for joining us, everybody who is here this morning, or wherever you are in your time zone, be it the morning, afternoon, or evening. Welcome. As always, I'll start by making a brief introduction. My name is Will Perrins. I am the Partnerships and Recruitment Manager for Opportunity China. I'm speaking to you today from a very wet and windy UK morning. I hope wherever you are, it's a little bit more pleasant for you at the moment. And what I'm going to talk about today is life outside work, Chinese history, culture, and immersion. Now, wherever you're joining us from, whether you are one of our Teach China graduate program candidates heading out to China in January or February, whether you are heading out to China to work in a role that we have found you, or if you are simply interested in living and working in China or anywhere on that recruitment line, welcome. There will be the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have at the end of our presentation today. So as always, I do welcome any questions that anyone wishes to ask to me. Let's kick on now and have a look at what we are going to cover today. So we'll begin by taking a glance at modern Chinese history and culture. In order to be able to understand exactly what's going on around you, it's vital to have a historical perspective on why things are done a particular way in Chinese culture in day-to-day life, and also take a look at how you might deal with particular situations as and when they arise. What I'm also going to take a look at today is going to be China's beauty and diversity. So we're going to be having a look at the sights, sounds, smells, and indeed food of China that you're going to experience when you first arrive. We're also going to be taking a look at what sort of things you can expect in an ongoing sense. We're going to then take a look at the great firewall of China and social media. I think it would be very wrong to look at China without talking about some of the points that are definitely going to be a little trickier for those coming from the West. The Great Firewall is quite infamous, but a lot of those heading out to China still don't really fully understand or comprehend exactly what it means, what it encompasses, and also what the legal situation is for you whilst you're out there as well. So again, it's an area that's quite complex and I think quite important to cover. We'll then take a look at getting around China, so modes of transportation, how you can get to places. We'll delve a little more into food in China, and we'll also chat a bit about leisure and entertainment, what you can do to spend your spare time away from the classroom. So let's take a look, first of all, at an introduction to modern Chinese history. It's important to begin from the beginning, and China is an ancient country. China boasts the world's longest continuous civilization at over 5,000 years. In many of my university visits across the United Kingdom, I've had 2 or 3 different history lectures come up to me and contest this, actually, speaking about Mesopotamia, but I'm not entirely sure that that culture is continuous or still existing today. For the vast majority of its history, China has been ruled by dynasties and commonly divided into multiple kingdoms. Many different cities in China have acted as the de facto and indeed de jure capital of what we consider to be China today. And because of this dynastic period that lasted for such a long time, with direct rule from a monarchy lasting until 1912, there is still a lot of cultural hangover in terms of the reaction to authority in China, as well as certain social standards that exist. What we're going to look at then after that happens is the 1912 overthrow of the Qing dynasty and the formation of the Republic of China. This was founded originally to remove the dynastic periods and broke with thousands and thousands of years of tradition. The 1912 government saw its way through the Sino-Japanese Wars, as well as the Second World War, and also the civil war between the communists and the nationalists who represented the Republic of China. And in 1949, it became the People's Republic of China, following the victory of the communists in the Chinese Civil War. Now, the 20th century was a real century of struggle for China. And the reason I dedicate an entire slide to this is I think it's really important to understand this century and have a respect for this century and a knowledge of this century when going to China, in order to try and best understand the reactions of people in the street today, moods that exist, and the kind of culture that's there. The 20th century was a tremendous century of struggle for the Chinese people. It was fraught with hardship and struggle, not least due to the devastating civil war between the nationalists and communists that I mentioned earlier, between 1927 and 1950, with the communists being led by Mao Zedong. You can see there just in the middle on the right-hand side, and the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek. This civil war left an estimated 8 million people dead because of it. Some estimates put that significantly higher as a direct result of fighting between communists and nationalists. Of course, sandwiched in between this civil war, you had the Second Sino-Japanese War, and also World War II, as we know it. Again, this was incredibly devastating. It led to situations where there were uneasy alliances between the communists and nationalists in China, who would join forces to fight the Japanese at particular junctures before turning on one another and fighting one another. It's estimated that the Sino-Japanese War and the effects of World War II left around 22 million civilian deaths, between them equaling around 30 million people dead between 1927 and 1950 as a result of these wars. Now, the Sino-Japanese War had a direct result that still exists today in China when it comes to things like anti-Japanese sentiment and protectionism. If you were to live and work in the northeast of China, in what was previously the Manchukuo region, where there was tremendous repression of the Chinese citizens by the Japanese army, it is a tragic but interesting area to look at, and to really try and understand that mentality that exists today. Then, from 1949 and the foundation of the People's Republic of China, there were several different attempts by Mao to revolutionize Chinese economy and society. The Great Leap Forward between 1958 and 1962, which was an amalgamation of sweeping reforms across all different areas, led to many different tragedies, not least the Great Chinese Famine, and left an estimated 45 million people dead. And following that, the social reforms of Mao's Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 had very long-lasting implications on China's culture, as well as the artifacts and history that exist and that you can see today. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, a poster that was very common during the Cultural Revolution in China, about forging a new world. And you can see there a Revolutionary Red Guard member with a giant sledgehammer literally smashing to pieces artifacts from China's history. And this was very much what happened. Many beautiful works of art that were deemed to be counter-revolutionary or non-communist were destroyed. Many areas of scenic beauty that were deemed to be bourgeois were simply concreted over. And much of China's history was exported to museums and to collectors around the world during this time period. Now, this certainly isn't to say that this century of struggle lives on in China today. As many of you will know, China is an emerging superpower of the world. It is a dynamic, fast-paced, interesting country that is emerging technologically, economically, and socially to become a global superpower. But how did we get from that century of struggle to the China that we know today? Well, as a very brief and layman's interpretation, China's emerging status as a superpower can argue to have started in the mid-70s after Mao's death, when Deng Xiaoping emerged as the de facto leader of China. Interestingly, Deng Xiaoping never held the title of any of the high offices of state that would usually constitute being a de facto leader. He was never president, he was never chairman of the Central Committee, but he was the de facto leader of China. And he issued several sweeping reforms. In 1978, China began to open up to the world. China began to export. When I was growing up and was very young and in my teenage years, the interpretation and the view of China was largely that it was the workhouse of the world. It was the place where things were made. If you looked on the bottom of something, it would almost say made in China. And these reforms were brought about by Deng Xiaoping in conjunction with market model economic reforms domestically. People were now able to begin to think entrepreneurially. People were able to think in a business sense. People were able to develop and push forward. And there was less repression from the state and more freedom economically among the people in China. This resulted in an average yearly GDP growth of around 10% until 2015. Now, from 2015 onwards, a common mistake has been, oh, they're growing less, therefore it's a worrying sign. Actually, growing 10% pretty much every year from the 80s until 2015 is staggering enough in itself and shows an economy that's stabilizing. In 2015 itself, China still grew the size of the Swiss economy. So simply the growth that China experienced was the entire size of Switzerland's whole economy. And this growth has led to a huge level of urbanization. There's the largest human migration in history currently occurring in China, from rural to urban China. And recently, several estimates have put that China has finally edged over into being a slight majority urban population as opposed to rural. This has led to an emergence of what are called mega cities in China. So this could be the conjunction between several small cities and larger cities, creating giant super cities, such as Chongqing, or it could be the growth of entirely new cities, or what are effectively new cities being built on previous areas of countryside around existing cities. A great example of this are the pictures that I have on the right here. Now, this is Shenzhen in the south of China. Shenzhen is a first-tier city in China with a metropolitan population estimated at around 19 million people. You can see on the top right here what Shenzhen looked like in 1980. You can see down here what Shenzhen looked like in 2011. This shows the kind of staggering growth that is occurring in China. The fact that these major cities, the sites of China's second stock exchange, the site of what is known as China's Silicon Valley, exists in what was previously a very small coastal town. In China today, the urban population is enormous. There are over 160 cities with a population in excess of 1 million. To give you a little bit of context, in the United Kingdom, there are 2 cities with a population in excess of 1 million. It's a modern and growing country with a modern and growing middle class. Those now in their 30s and 40s are the first leadership generation in China that grew up with these market reforms, of understanding it, that grew up outside of the Cultural Revolution and what occurred within that. And this is beginning to show in the reforms that are occurring in China, in the development of China as well. It's competing in the global marketplace on a massive scale and innovating for the future. China is also buying back its history, which harks back to that Cultural Revolution element. Collectors who had previously managed to catch beautiful fans and artifacts and statues and statuettes from China before they were destroyed, are now being inundated with bids from Chinese investors wanting to buy back that history that was destroyed or went abroad. And they're global facing in an international way. This is no more true than the relationship between China and Britain from 2015 onwards, with the golden generation of cooperation occurring now between the two countries. But China is also looking outwards to other countries and to countries that surround it to act as a leadership figure. With the dissipating and quietening voice of the United States on the global stage, China is beginning to step up to the mark and become an incredibly important country. Socially, in soft power as well, elements like the Chinese Super League. As an enormous football fan myself, I've certainly taken note of the money that is being spent by the Chinese Super League, with tens and tens of millions of pounds or dollars being spent on players that maybe it would be generous to call world class, but nonetheless enticing them over to China to play. There are, though, still some hard truths about living and working in China. This all comes under the enormous emphasis in China of stability and authority that exists. This comes through a fear of arching back into anarchy, of instability, of times in that 20th century where the real sobering memory of those hard truths still exist. And because of this, there are certain freedoms in China that we really do take for granted that simply do not exist. There's no freedom of the press. There are no free newspapers who can state what they want about the government or about particular figures. And this sips through into speech a little bit as well. A common misconception very often is that people in black suits will come and take you away and throw you in a little prison cell if you say something bad or are seen to say something bad in China. Largely this is very much not true, but many in China will speak like that to be uncomfortable around them. So being very careful and cautious as to what you say within this context is important when living and working in China. This extends to freedom of assembly, whereas in our countries, we can organise protests to say we don't like something. This, again, is not true in China. Wounds are still sore from a tragic past as well, which comes back to that anti-Japanese sentiment that exists, not just in China, but in other countries in Asia as well, like Korea and Thailand. There's discussion of politics too, which is generally not the norm, at least not in the norm that we would have in the West. Being from Britain, pretty much a constant topic of conversation around everyone, no matter how hard you might try to not have an opinion on it or not speak about it, would be Brexit. These things, again, are not the norm in China. There is an enormous attitude in China when it comes to facing globally of, we don't interfere in what you do or what you say, so you shouldn't interfere in what we do or what we say. This is pretty much always the press release that comes from China's Foreign Office in any global event that is put at the end of any statement that they make. China does very rarely come out and condemn global governments, whatever side they are, for anything. Individual opinion in China is also not seen as being as highly valued or regarded as the opinion of the majority or as the opinion of the group. China is a communal society. It's a society where if you act in the interest of your country, of your people, of your family, of the group around you, that is seen as much more preferable than individual ambition. Again, this is a difference that it's important to think about when expressing a tone or way of speaking in China. Let's take a look now at China's beauty and diversity. Let's take a look at what makes China a wonderful country to live in. First of all, there is the scenery. When I talk about diversity, this is first and foremost in my mind. China is a country not dissimilar to the United States in that it is a land beast. It is a country that contains both massive deserts as well as mighty tundras. It is a country that has some of the most beautiful UNESCO World Heritage sites, side alongside with some of the largest, most dynamic, exciting and brightly lit neon megacities. You can see here a few examples of these, whether it's in the northwest, in Xinjiang province, or even in Tibet, where you have the Great Tibetan Plateau, in Xinjiang province, the Gobi Desert that spreads all across western China. In the northeast, you have Harbin and the Ice Festival, which is world famously held every year with giant ice sculptures of palaces and famous world landmarks. Then you have in the south some of the beautiful and fascinating UNESCO World Heritage sites in Hunan province, Jiangjiagang, and in Guangxi province, the Longji rice terraces. Then you have the megacities such as Shanghai, Beijing, Chongqing, that spread for miles and miles and miles, that have great, diverse and vibrant nightlife. Again, you can take a look here at some of the more diverse scenes that you can expect to see living and working in China. And I'll chat a little bit about getting around and going between these places in a moment, and how China's transportation network really does make it quite easy to do so. Let's take a look at a few examples from some of the popular regions many of you are going to, of places to head to. In Chengdu, you have Shangli Ancient Town, as well as the panda sanctuaries, which is home to the natural habitat of giant pandas. Shenyang, the imperial palace that was home to many Qing emperors, and previously a capital of what we would consider to be China today. Beijing, the Summer Palace, as well as the Forbidden City, the seat of many emperors and the capital of China. Changsha, Zhangjiajie National Park, as I briefly mentioned earlier, in Foshan. You have Nanhai, Guanyin, and Fuzhou, Qingyushan scenic area with some dramatic views across mountains and countryside. Now, it's all well and good saying that there are some wonderful places in China, but China is also an enormous country. It's a country that spreads for miles and miles and miles. And of course, you need a reliable transportation network to get you around, or even to get you around within your city with these giant metropolises existing. Cost depends on the city that you're living in, but on average, you will find that the cost of travel in China is very reasonable. Buses going within a city from one stop to another are often paid by a single journey and are usually around 1 to 2 renminbi a journey. 1 to 2 renminbi or kwai or yuan is roughly the equivalent of around 15 to 30 pence, or if you were using US dollars, around 25 to 40 cents. The metro, depending on the distance of journey, would be between 2 to 6 yuan. You can see an example of a modern metro service here in a second-tier city in China. This is actually in Shenyang. This was the metro service that I used to get pretty much every day. The vast majority of new cities in China have these metro services. They were usually built in and around the mid and early noughties. Taxis in China are also very cheap, starting from around 8 kwai to around 13 kwai for the beginning of a journey, traveling around 20 minutes. So a reasonable little distance would usually cost you around 15 kwai within a city. And then, of course, you have the bike rental schemes, which are now enormously popular in China. The biggest difference going back to China this summer that I saw from when I was last there are how many of these rental bikes are now within these cities. They are absolutely flooded with them. Rental bikes in China are usually free for the first hour, and then you'd pay 1 renminbi for every hour that you have afterwards. But let's take a look at exploring China and how to get around. China has an enormous high-speed rail network that connects the vast majority of major cities in one way or another. It is astounding going from a public transportation system like that in the UK to going to the one in China in terms of how impressive it is. Those of you who have travelled to Japan before would probably be familiar with the Shinkansen or bullet train. These are also in operation in China on their high-speed rail network. You can see on the top right there. A journey from Beijing to Shanghai on one of these can be done in around 4 hours and 48 minutes, as opposed to taking on what would last in a normal train, probably about 14 to 16 hours. There are also sleeper trains available in China, which are a little bit slower, that do take you that bit longer, but are a great way to explore China. If you want to see more smaller places, they're a great option to take to rattle along on, as well as internal flights, which you can find quite cheaply, particularly compared to domestic flights in a Western sense. Make sure you use things like C-Trip or Trip, as it is now called, or better, ask a Chinese friend or colleague to book it in the Chinese language app, as it's actually usually cheaper if you're using a Chinese language app. Food in China now. Again, speaking about diversity, food is another area that's incredibly interesting to look at. Dining in China is very different to what we're used to in the West. It's a very communal event. Dining in China, you are usually expected to eat around friends and family. Multiple plates and bowls are shared between everyone. You'd usually have a spinning jenny like that in the middle that would be spun around, and you would pick what you wanted from those plates and bowls and lay it down. This is quite useful for vegetarians as well, because generally hosts are very accommodating of this, and you're able to separate your food from the rest. Restaurants in China are gauged very differently to many restaurants in the West, where we usually gauge the quality of an upmarket restaurant by its ambiance and by a lowness in volume. Whereas a restaurant in China is gauged very much on the amount of noise that is there, on the volume that's there. This shows that people are enjoying eating in this place. It shows that it's vibrant. It shows that it's a great communal place to be around. It's important to be aware of cultural norms when dining in China, particularly with your boss. Things like ensuring you're sat in the right place. It may seem silly at the time, but these are very important in China. The figure with most authority is always sitting facing the door, and the figure with least authority is always sat in the furthest away position that can be deemed from doing that. Ganbeiing, or clearing your glass. Very often toasts will be made in China from small glasses that will usually be filled with beer or other drinks, and you'd be expected to clear your glass after every ganbei. And when toasting and clinking your glasses, always ensure, if you are doing it with a figure of authority, that you clink lower in their glass to show them respect. Again, this comes down to that status of authority that still exists within China today. Then you have your regional cuisines, which are a treat for everyone living in various different destinations in China. Of course, in the major cities and in all cities in China, you can find examples of all of these food with many migrants from these cities bringing them across. Sichuan food is particularly popular across China. What you'll tend to find in cities like Beijing and Shanghai is a real blend and mix from all over China. But when it comes to the cuisines of China itself and the areas they come from, it's important to take a look at some of the great regional cuisines that you have. You have Sichuan, which is probably the most famous in China for its spicy food. Those of you that are fans of spicy beef, those of you that are fans of chili, Sichuan is an absolute dream. It's my personal favorite. Then you have Hunan, which in a similar sense is home to a lot of spicy food that really, in my opinion, can be a little too much even, as well as several hot and sour dishes. Then you have the Canton region. You have the Guangdong region, Cantonese food that's light and sweet as well as Zhejiang and Jiangsu, where you'll find similar kinds of dishes. Up into Fujian, where you have the wheaty mountain foods. Fujian and Anhui, famous for being very agricultural regions of China, and Shandong and coastal cities, where there's the fresh, salty seafood. You can see here again a few examples of some typical Chinese dishes that you might get. The sweet dishes here that you might expect to find in the south, the spicy dishes, the Shandong sort of seafood. Restaurants in China, restaurants are in absolute abundance in every city. Again, as I say, it is the common cultural norm as a social event to go out and eat with your friends and with your colleagues. Eating and drinking are generally done in the same places. There's an abundance of traditional Chinese restaurants. Everybody in China has their favorites. Going out with your Chinese colleagues is often great, as they'll take you to some amazing places. They certainly did with me. There are also the global fast food giants and coffee chains that you will find around every corner. There is a record number of KFCs in China. KFC actually is larger than McDonald's in China, believe it or not. Chicken is deemed to be a more desirable food. Fast food restaurants are growing in popularity in China enormously. This is partially because they are deemed to be clean and safe foods to eat by many people in China because of the international food quality standards that they need to meet. There's a very different view in China of fast food, like McDonald's and KFC, to that in the West. Almost that it's healthy, which is quite bizarre when you first go over there. You'll also find many Western-centric restaurants, particularly in first-tier cities and large second-tier cities, who are looking to cater to a growing expat community. These Western-centric restaurants are generally working purely in English. So waiters will speak to you in English, you'll get your food ordered in that way. They're usually a little more expensive though. You'll also find many vegetarian and traditional Buddhist restaurants in China. Of course, China does still have a large Buddhist population, many of whom are vegetarian. These restaurants are really wonderful and quite special to go to and offer a real authentic experience where you won't find meat in the dishes. They'll usually offer really interesting tofu and vegetable alternatives to traditional Chinese dishes. Even if you're not a vegetarian, I certainly recommend seeking these places out. Let's talk now about the Great Firewall of China. In China, there are many sites that you cannot access. In fact, well, from a personal point of view, pretty much all sites that I would use in China, I would be unable to access. Sites that you cannot access in China include Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, all Google sites. So this includes Gmail. It also includes YouTube, incorporated as part of Google Drive, as well as everything that comes along with that. This is really important to remember because it leaves you in a little bit of an awkward position if you do not have a VPN. There are many who want to go to China to get a real cultural Chinese experience and say, no, I don't want to get a VPN. I want to do everything exactly the way it's going to be. You want to try it, you're more than welcome to. There are ways around it. I do know people who have not used VPNs in China and gotten along perfectly well. I personally could not really be without my Facebook, my YouTube, or indeed my Gmail account. So having a VPN is pretty much a requirement in China for the vast majority of Westerners going over there. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network. And again, in layman's terms, and in terms that I understand it anyway, it essentially sets your VPN address as a country outside of China or a location outside of China. So it makes you appear to the sensors that you are outside of China. There are numerous different providers. They often offer monthly paid subscriptions. We actually work with ExpressVPN, who you can see up there. If you're interested in learning more about ExpressVPN, please do drop me a message and I'll be able to send you a link to some of the offers that they have. It's one of the most widely used VPN services in China and one of the most popular and reliable. it's important to download and install your VPN before you get to China. This is a bit of a rookie mistake quite a lot of people make. It's important to do this, as if you go to ExpressVPN's website, of course, that will be itself blocked in China. So having the software downloaded, installed, having the codes installed on your mobile devices, on your laptop, on your tablet is very important before you head out to China. But China has its own popular social media sites. The biggest one is WeChat. Now, I recommend anyone who is watching this video at the moment, if you haven't downloaded WeChat already, download it now. It will become your life in China. And it is also the life of most people who just work in China or work with China. WeChat is used for messaging, but also much more. WeChat is often used in lieu of email as the most popular professional communication device. It is pretty much entirely used as the social communication device. You can set up groups in a similar way to WhatsApp, but you can also use WeChat to do an abundance of things. You can use it to pay for taxis if you install a card on it, as well as split bills at restaurants. You can use it to pay for pretty much anything in almost any shop when you scan a QR code through your WeChat and it's attached to your bank account. Then you have Weibo, which is a popular microblogging site in China, essentially the Chinese Twitter. Youku or Tudou, which are the Chinese YouTube. They have less self-produced content than YouTube does in the West, with there not being quite so much of a vlogger or YouTuber phenomenon, at least not in the way that we would be used to it in China. Then you have Dianping, which is the Chinese Yelp, really, so for reviewing things, and Douban, which is a sort of music-y, Spotify-y, SoundCloud-y kind of app, where you can download and listen to music from across the world, and many artists can upload their own music too, as well. Of course, it's important to talk about entertainment and leisure in China as well. What you're actually going to be doing with your spare time when you're not eating in restaurants or browsing online using your VPN or traveling China. Well, in second tier, first tier, and indeed third tier cities in China, there's an abundance of entertainment that exists. If you want to see a film, there is very often an English language film being shown in English with subtitles at many cinemas across China. It's always important to look out for this. Only certain films are allowed into China, and the Chinese government has a limit on the number of foreign films that are allowed to be released in China each year in order to support their own cinema industry and their own filmmaking industry. There are currently 34 foreign releases permitted each year in China, which is a significant increase to when I was out there. There are also an abundance of expat local bars, clubs, and restaurants. Usually, these bars and restaurants are located within central districts and sort of clumped together within a kind of expat area. These are usually close to embassies or consulates for countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, or Australia. These bars, restaurants, and clubs usually do cater to a Western audience in a very direct way, with having English-speaking serving staff, also having quite tight-knit communities of other expats within them, and very often focusing in as quite a central area for communication between expats living within the city. China is also home to many state-of-the-art sports facilities, centres, and training areas. Now, these exist in both second, third, and of course in first-tier cities, with them being built for many of the sporting events that have been held in China throughout the last decade, not least including the 2008 Beijing Games, as well as the the 2008 Olympic Games, as well as the Asian Games, and many other sporting events that were held in China. This offers a really great opportunity to join expat sports teams or school sports teams or other sports teams that exist in China and play your sport out there. There's all manner of different kinds of sports that are played in China and the expats play in China. You can see here at the bottom, in the bottom right, that's actually a Shenzhen Gaelic football team, which is interesting in itself, that China's Guangdong region has a Gaelic football league, but shows you how diverse the sporting scene is in China. You can play rugby, football, pretty much any sport you want. It's fantastic for. Now, next week, we'll be looking at making the most of your China experience. During this webinar, we will be looking at what you can do to take the best of your experience, put it on a CV, and sell yourself for future work. What you can do and the skills that you'll attain to build a teaching career as well, if that's the route you want to take. Looking more closely at those transferable skills and taking a look at some of the options that could be ahead for you, as well as some of the experiences that our Teach China graduate program and former teachers have had after living and working in China, and also those hard skills that you will learn as well. What I'd like to do now is open it up to any questions that anyone might have. I shall take a look in our question box just here. So if anybody has any questions just at the moment, please do feel free to ask in the live chat box. Okay, I don't think we've got any coming up just there. But as always, if you do have any questions for us, do feel free to drop it into our info box or to contact myself or Steph directly, and we'll be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. Otherwise, it's been a pleasure as always speaking with you. Do share with any friends or family who might be interested in going to China or who are going to China and would find this interesting. And I will see you on Wednesday and be sending out links to our next webinar very soon and sharing across social media as well. Thank you very much for joining us, and goodbye.